everybody. So I thought it'd be interesting, stroke fun from a certain point of view, to do an introduction to figured bass. What is figured bass? Well, figured bass is the system of chord notation that was in use during the Baroque and classical eras. So all the musicians and composers and what have you, improvisers, because Mozart and Bach and everybody were great improvisers as well. Everybody making music at that point would have been familiar with this system. In the same way that, popular musicians, jazz musicians, rock musicians, people who play things like Fender Telecasters would be familiar with chord symbols today. Okay, so it's the equivalent of that. Now, there's a big difference, and this is why I think it's. But why would I, if I wasn't, about to, play theorbo for some opera company? Why would I be interested in this? And the answer is, I think it's an interesting way to look at harmony. Figured bass, unlike chord symbols, is built up from the bass. So the bass is the most important thing. And over the past few years, I've really started to be drawn more towards bassline-oriented thinking in jazz harmony too. You can really see it in composers like, for instance, Jobim, for instance, or definitely even more contemporary composers like Kenny Wheeler, who I think, if I remember correctly, might have had a strong interest in early music. I can't remember exactly. I'll have to look that up. And you can hear it from Pat Metheny and to an extent from people like Kurt Rosenwinkel as well. They're all heavy bassline-oriented composers, right? And they're interested in triadic sounds as well. If you listen to, for instance, Under It All by Kurt Rosenwinkel or James by Pat Metheny, you're going to hear some of this type of harmony. So it's never really gone away. And that makes sense because jazz, and indeed all contemporary music, is built on several foundations, one of which is the Western art music tradition. So, in terms of understanding harmony, and particularly because I love also Baroque music and classical music, or music of the classical era, I'm interested in it anyway, and it's interesting to see how you can get crossover from one to the other. So and also it's just an interesting thing to do in its own right. I find it interesting to learn how older musicians learnt in previous eras. Anyway, I'll move on quickly because you're probably tired of me talking. So I'm going to talk a little bit about just the basic two chords, or two sonorities, as I like to call them in the classical world, that you will find in typical figured bass. So the two basic chords are the 5/3 and 6/3. Okay, and the numbers is how figured bass works, as the name suggests. So you have the bass line, written on a bass clef. Sorry about that, guitarists. And then underneath you'll have little numbers. And when these numbers are written out in full form, 5/3 means you add a fifth and a third, diatonic fifth and a third, to whatever bass note it is. So if in the key of G, that'll be, a fifth in the key of G, and a third in the key of G if you're in C, so on, right? Or a 6/3, a sixth and a third, are added above the bass line. So if you spent any time sort of studying your interval scales, it says, mucking it up, you might have some sense of this, how this works. By the way, it's really good to study intervals on the guitar. Third's probably being the most obvious one. Sorry. Yeah, for instance. So you have that picture of the intervals through the given key. And one of the most useful intervals for any of this is actually the 10th, which is like a third with an octave added, and you'll see this in tunes like so I can't play it hybrid style. Let's just edit. So the way figured bass works is you have the bass line obviously written out, and for this example we're just going to take a G major scale going up and down like that, and you have that written out in the bass clef. Sorry, guitarists. And then underneath you might see some figures. So these are usually written in a sort of abbreviated form, but the two basic sonorities that we're dealing with in figured bass would be the 5/3 and the 6/3 chords, okay? And the 5/3 chord, if you see 5/3, it simply means add a fifth and a third to the bass note. So for instance, in the case of G, that would be a D, which is the fifth, and a B, which is the third. These can, figures vary. Sometimes it might write down as a tenth, but usually if they just write a third, that means you can put it in whatever octave you want. So you could play this voicing, for instance, which is an open voicing, or that voicing, which is a closed voicing, right? That's the bass line. And that will depend on your taste and the niceties of voice leading, right? Okay, 6/3 would be the B again, third, but also adding in an E, which is the sixth, for instance, right? Okay, that's in 3 voices. You can also double notes as well, most often the bass. I think it's probably useful just to sort of play the 5/3 and 6/3 chords through the scale. This is not something that they would generally do because it doesn't make for good harmony, but it'll help you understand how the system works. So in both cases we're adding the third to it, and by the way, in shorthand it's generally assumed for most chords that the third is part of the chord, and then you add like 5s or 6s or a 6 and a 5 sometimes, you know, whatever, to that basic third. So when you look at shorthand, proper figured bass notation shorthand, if it's a 5/3 they just won't write anything, and if it's a 6/3 they'll just write a 6. If it's a 6/5/3 they'll write a 6/5, and so on, right? So there's, again, it's like chord symbols, a bit of an ad hoc system, so it doesn't always make logical sense, but that's generally most often true. Okay, so we'll start off with our thirds. We'll play them as tenths because that sounds really nice. See, so I was mucking it up. It sounds really nice when you play it right. You might notice that sort of sound from Blackbird by the Beatles, for instance. Thelonious Monk. I've just been, at some point I'll get it out, but I've just been learning Crepuscule with Nelly, which is just full of lovely tenth stuff. Like, Monk really liked tenths. So anyway, going up the G major scale. This is major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, minor, major. Now we can add fifths to that, which gives us these root position open triads. And this is a diminished coming up, diminished triad. That sounds nice, but it doesn't constitute good Baroque voice leading because of this, or classical, because of this fifth thing going on here. And you may be dimly aware that every time you play a consecutive or parallel fifth, J.S. Bach kills a kitten. So in the interests of feline welfare, please don't do that. Okay, let's do the 6/3 as well. So that's the first inversion, if you like. 6/3 chords are, in modern understanding, would be first inversion triads. So this would be like an E minor with a G in the bass. That would be the F sharp diminished triad with a A in the bass, and so on. But that's not how they thought about it in the classical era, apparently. Okay, going on. Listening to that, you might think that we've gotten away with some, you know, we haven't harmed any cats in the process of doing that, but actually closer examination reveals that we have been very, very lax on animal welfare in the progression of that exercise. So again, apologies. I have a cat. I hope he's escaped that. He's probably outside, so it's okay. So with that in mind, we probably want to avoid, even though that's quite a nice, you know, it's quite a nice thing. I won't do it again. This is a nice thing. It actually doesn't sound too bad because the parallel fifths are a bit better hidden. And actually, I don't get the feeling that when people were doing these basic figured bass realizations, they were that fussed about consecutive fifths. It's something like when you're improvising, it's something that's hard to always make sure you're avoiding. And actually, when I look at some of the sort of examples of harmonizations of the scale from that era, there's quite often a few naughty consecutive fifths thrown in there, which you'll see in a minute, actually. So I wouldn't necessarily be that fussed about it, but it's worth bearing in mind. Okay, but in practice, what we want is a kind of good voice leading, just as we would for, you know, playing jazz chords. So one thing you can do is make sure that the same note is in the top register, and the other thing is we can mix up the 5/3s and 6/3s of it. So this brings us to the basic, most simple regole dell'ottavio, or rule of the octave, which is basically I think what they would have used in the 17th century. In 17th century music, you probably wouldn't have got any figures. It'd just be like, yeah, you work it out, it's easy, right? And it's mostly 4 chords and the truth back then anyway, right? So they didn't have massively complicated chords. Getting on to the later 17th century and 18th century, you see more complex harmony, which is why figures started to come into vogue more. So for this very simple harmonization, we're going to be using 5/3 chord on the 2 most important chords of the key, which are, of course, the 1 and the 5, the dominant, right? Now, everything else is a 6/3. Now, to sort of make things a bit better, a bit more useful, particularly for accompaniment, where you don't necessarily want to do anything too active while the singer's doing a thing, or the flute player, whoever it is. We want to kind of keep the same sort of note on top, so it's going to move around a little bit, but it's going to come back. So with that in mind, I've just written out a very basic rule of the octave in tablature using these basic chords. So first chord is a 5/3, beg your pardon, which I'm playing like this. I can't use my thumb because it's classical music, right? I have to be a good boy. Okay, the next one is a 6/3 on A, another 6/3 on B, and we have a 6/3 on C. And I've gone down there, if you notice, on the top note down to a C, just to make it a bit better voice leading, to use a technical term. D major chord there, 6th chord, so 5/3 chord on D, should I say, a 6/3 on E, a 6/3 on F sharp, and back to 5/3. So we go down. I'll bet that note today, apparently. And then, so you can hear these notes just move around. Very, very simple top note melody there. Nothing that would draw attention to itself in an ensemble. Okay, so that's great. And I think we've managed to avoid playing too many consecutive fifths as well with that one, if any. I can't see any, but if you spot any, do write in below, because everybody loves it when you point out a consecutive fifth. Okay, so apart from the fact that it sounds quite nice, but it's a little bit boring, so maybe you want to add some extra life and energy to it, and we're just going to add some extra notes to the 6/3 chords going up. So I'm going to add a 4th to the 2nd chord. I'm going to add an extra 5 to the 1 on C, so it becomes effectively a 6 major 6th chord, as we'd understand it in jazz. And then I'm going to add a 6 crossed 5, and crossed 5 means a diminished fifth. Even though it's diatonic to the key, it's quite nice to write it out, which will be like this. That'll lead us back to the, or maybe this, and lead us back to the G. Okay. And in practice, both the 6/4/3 chord and the 6 crossed 5 chord are in versions of D7. Okay, but they didn't think about it like that back then. And actually, even though it might seem simpler to start off with, I'm finding the more I'm getting into this, the more I prefer figures to chord symbols for this kind of stuff, because they're much more specific about the voice leading and the counterpoint. And this stuff is really all about counterpoint. That's why they're using intervals and not theoretical roots. And theoretical root harmony ideas didn't really come in until the mid-18th century. And even then, a lot of the professional composers apparently basically ignored it because it wasn't that relevant to what they were doing. So this sort of contrapuntal approach with the intervals is actually how people like Bach and Mozart and all the rest of them would actually have thought. Anyway, so I'm just going to play this more fancier rule, ascending, so you can hear what it sounds like. Okay, then it's this. Nice. We're going to go to the 6. Then the 6/5 chord, notice there's a consecutive there. But this is actually taken, this is a slight reduction, with a couple of notes missed out, of Fenaroli's Rule of the Octave from the 18th century. So he wrote it, not me. Okay. Another consecutive fifth on the D. Again, he wrote it, not me. That's 5/3 chord. 6/3, and then the 6 crossed 5, G. So I'll just play it through in one breath without the talking. Nice, huh? Sounds very classical already. Okay, and if we descend, we make other changes. So going back to the 6/3, G, we we go down to the 6th chord on F sharp. We don't have the 5 in there, the crossed 5. And then we go down to this C over E, and we raise actually the 6th, which is the note C, up by a half step. Get that chord, which you might think of even as an augmented 6th. I mean, it's not an augmented 6th as it's understood in modern music theory, but we are definitely augmenting that 6th. And then that brings us very nicely into D major. In today's understanding, that would be a secondary dominant, A7 moving to D, right? Like take the A train. Okay, and then my favourite chord is when we basically just change the bass note but keep the top of the chord the same. This is a D/C, the Pat Metheny Lydian chord, if you will, or if you're more traditional, a third inversion D7. But the Lydian chord thing is actually probably closer to how they viewed it back then. We've written this with the figure 6 sharp 4 2. The sharp 4 is diatonic to the key of G major, but we've written it in anyway, which you often see. This creates that lovely lift. There's some beautiful things you can do with that particular chord, which I'll maybe talk about in future videos. 6th, and then this 6/4/3, 6/4 chord, and then back to the G again. Okay, so the thing to notice about that is we're going up and down differently. We're going up like this. Descending like this. Little embellishment there just to add a bit of fun to it. Always a sucker for a little bit of suspension at the end there as well. Suspension is when you pull one note from one chord into the next chord. Okay. Now I'm just going to give you a little bit of an example from real music. This is 17th century harmony, which is a bit simpler than 18th century harmony, so it should be fairly straightforward to understand. Now in this case, this is taken from a very famous piece of music called Porte Miro, which is a duo from Incoronazioni di Popir. Sorry, apologies for the Italian. I just thought I'd do one example from real music. So this is a very simple bass line taken from a very famous 17th century piece called Porte Miro by Monteverdi. It's from the opera The Coronation of Poppea, and it's sung by Poppea and Nero at the end of the opera. Terrible people who sing this absolutely ravishing duet. You know, it's beautiful, these aching dissonances. One of the most famous pieces of music from that era. Do listen to it, it's great. Anyway, so this bass line is just the first 4 notes, a tetrachord, if you like, descending G major scale. And because they're stepwise like that, it's a perfect reason to use our rule of the octave, right? So we're going to go in the simplest way, 3 voices, G, D/F sharp, and we could use we could raise the C up to a C sharp there, except for the fact that if you look at the music, which I flashed up a second ago, so you obviously noticed that, it's a C natural in the melody, and then a 5/3 chord, D. And actually I quite like, this is in what we might call second position, meaning that we've got the 5th on top of the first chord. Second position would be the 3rd. And if we play it in first position, we've got the root, the G on top, so we're going to do it with the G on top. And then we can do it in 4 voices like that, which is nice. And we can even add in some suspensions if we like. So nothing complex. I mean, you're not exactly improvising a Bach fugue there, but you could even start to, put some extra notes in there. Like that, for instance. So you would do that maybe as an introduction, but you probably wouldn't do that when the singers were going on. It's the same principle as jazz comping. It's like you leave gaps when something else is going on, and then you add a little bit of detail or something that draws the ear when you've got a bit of space. Most music operates that way, from jazz to baroque music to choro, all sorts of things. Anyway, I hope you found it interesting. This is something that I'm obviously getting into. It's not the usual sort of thing you'd come across in this channel. Seeing as it is the jazz guitar scrapbook and not the baroque scrapbook. But hopefully, if you enjoyed this kind of stuff, I might make a few more videos on it as I explore this further. And what I am particularly interested in is seeing how I can link this up to, my main area of thing, which is jazz. I'm not necessarily interested in going off and playing lute in a Baroque orchestra, but hopefully by seeing how these principles can give you beautiful classical voice leading and so on, it can help with understanding how we can understand harmony in a wider sense and apply it to jazz. Anyway, let me know what you think below. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you soon. Thank you. Bye.